So I try to be as nice to him as possible, even though I do torment him sometimes by leaning books against him and stuff like that.
Well, it was the warmest temperature I saw today here in Bozeman was -11. So I kind of wish I was curled up on a heated blanket right now.
Yeah, I highly recommend them. Maybe powered by lasers, which would be like.
Exactly. Yes. Well, as everyone is sort of filling into our wonderful space, thank you all for joining us this evening. We are absolutely delighted to have you join us here. Hi, Janelle. Yes, lasers.
We were just talking about you, Janelle, because of lasers.
I'm your host, Jessica, the event coordinator at Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, and we are so grateful to be sharing this virtual space with our fellow Books in Common Northwest stores, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Visit www.booksincommonNW.com for more information about all the other great upcoming events we have with our Books in Common series. And be sure to follow us on Eventbrite so that you can be registered and notified for all the goodness that we have planned for this year. Before we get to our speakers this evening, I do want to point out a couple things about our virtual space. You can purchase a copy of Four Lost Cities and more from Annalee Newitz by visiting Books in Common NW and clicking on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store down at the bottom of the page. We are recording this event and it will be viewable at a later date on the Books in Common NW YouTube channel. And if you run into any problems and for some reason can't get back into the webinar, do just jump over there because we are live streaming over there. If you have questions for our panelists as we go through the presentation today, please submit them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or drop them in the chat and we'll get to them as time allows. If you run into any tech issues along the way, headphones work great for sound issues. Exiting and re-entering is also a great way to restart and hopefully you won't miss much. I do wish to acknowledge that we here in Bozeman are occupying the ancestral unceded land of the Apsalahi Crow, Salish Kootenai, Cheyenne, Shoshone Bannock, and Ochady Shokoan peoples. We do encourage those of you joining us from outside Bozeman and Montana to learn more about the land that you occupy and the stories of its peoples. I do also want to remind you that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone who has joined us this evening. So anyone who is being disrespectful or inappropriate will be dismissed. I just lost my spot. Annalee Newitz writes science fiction and nonfiction. They are the author of the book Four Lost Cities, The Secret History of the Urban Age, which is what has brought you all here to us this evening. And the novels The Future of Another Timeline and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. As a science journalist, they're a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and have a monthly column in New Scientist. They have published in the Washington Post, Slate, Popular Science, Ars Technica, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic, among others. They are also the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. Previously, they were the founder of IO9 and served as the editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. Sarah Zhang is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers science, biotechnology, and genetics. In a previous life, she studied neurobiology and spent a lot of time with fruit flies. Before joining The Atlantic in 2016, she was a staff writer at Wired. Zhang's work has also appeared in the New York Times, Nature, Discover, and Method Quarterly, among others. She is the recipient of an American Association for the Advancement of Science Kavli Science Journalism Award, and Zhang studied neurobiology and graduated from Harvard University. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'm so excited to get to talk about Four Lost Cities. I will be dropping that link in the chat if you didn't purchase your copy of the book when you registered. But without further ado, Annalee, Sarah, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for hosting us. And I just wanted to start by saying that even if you don't buy my book from one of the bookstores participating in Books in Common, buy a bunch of other books. These are fantastic independent bookstores. They're keeping reading alive. They're making your community a happy place for opening up a thing or looking at a thing on a your e-reader and like enjoying words that don't have sounds necessarily associated with them. So please just buy all the books. All the books behind me came from bookstores. You can do it too. Please destroy your life by having giant, huge bookshelves everywhere in your house. Make your life better. So I am super excited to be here with Sarah, who I worked with at Gizmodo back in the mists of time. And she's one of my favorite science journalists out there. If you're not reading her work, you should be, because she always has amazing, like she'll take time to do deep dives on incredibly complicated subjects. And then sometimes she'll do stories that are incredibly funny that you never knew had a science angle. So they are just, you have to be following Sarah. This is my final word on the matter. So what I'm going to do is read very briefly from the book, and then we're going to chat about it. So I wanted to just start by saying that this is a book that is called Four Lost Cities, which is basically about how cities can't ever get lost. And it's also about how cities never actually go away, even though a lot of the book deals with the idea of urban abandonment and urban collapse. I'm also talking a lot about how today archaeologists don't really buy into this idea of collapse anymore. It turns out that, like everything in life, collapse is a lot more complicated than you might think. So I'm going to read to you from a section of the book that is about the ancient city of Cahokia, which was a going concern in North America about 1,000 years ago. It's an indigenous city. It's located in southern Illinois, across the Mississippi from St. Louis. And when the city was at its largest, when it had its biggest population, I'm now putting a map of the city up here for you to look at. The city was huge. It stretched from southern Illinois all the way across the Mississippi into St. Louis. And it had several precincts, they're called, just basically urban centers separated by farmland and suburban residential areas. So there's a ton of interesting things to say about Cahokia. But what I want to focus on right now and in my reading is that Cahokia is a great example of how when it seems like a city is collapsing or being or sort of falling apart, it might be better to think of it as undergoing transformation. And so this is a section of the book where I've been hanging out with a couple of amazing archaeologists at Cahokia, getting dirty, getting bitten by flies. And I've been trying to get them to tell me about the city's demise. And I keep sort of bugging them and saying, like, well, how did it happen? And so over a period of several days, and then over many years after that, as I was researching this book, I came to appreciate that asking archaeologists about collapse is not the right question. So here I am just sort of talking about what Cahokia would have looked like and how it changed over time. Against the dark, swampy mud, the wood-framed and thatched houses of Cahokians were colorful, decorated with mats, carvings, and plaster. Cahokians planted wooden poles in public areas, possibly painted and decorated with fur, feathers, baskets of grain, and other symbolic items. We can't be sure whether these poles were ceremonial or more like signposts. Maybe they were both. Archaeologists can see where they were placed by charting the locations of deep cylindrical holes punched into the earth of the mounds, plazas, and the front yards of houses. Though the wood has long ago rotted away, its shape remains, sometimes with a bit of ceremonial mica or ochre at the bottom, tucked beneath the bottom of the post. So if you look at this map, you can see the central Cahokia precinct, and there, kind of in the breakout box at the upper left, you can see that there was, at the center of town, there was this giant earthen mound that today we call Monk's Mound. It has a footprint about the size of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It's enormous. And in front of that mound, there was a large plaza for public gatherings and many other ceremonial mounds and structures. So back to this reading. Archaeologists mark the eras of the city based on the orientation of its houses. During the Loman phase, which is roughly 1050 to 1100 CE, when people first built Cahokia's Grand Plaza and Monk's Mound, they organized their houses into courtyard patterns with several dwellings facing small central plazas. During the Sterling phase, which is 1100 to 1200 CE, which is often called classical Cahokia, which is its own whole thing about whether cities should actually have a classical period or not. But anyway, we'll just go with it. Classical Cahokia. During that time, people built on a strict grid with houses and mounds oriented in a north-south direction. This was also the city's heyday when it had the biggest population. And in the final phase of the city, which is called the Moorhead phase, which is roughly from 1200 to 1350 CE, people returned to the courtyard plans of the Loman phase. So the city has been the urban grid has been completely redesigned twice, really 3 times, because of course the initial Loman phase also overlay a village. So they had to sort of bury the village and put their city on top. But these different city phases weren't just architectural fads. Archaeologist Susan Alt argues that the transformation marked social change. Nowhere are these changes more obvious than in the downtown area where Monk's Mound rises above the Grand Plaza. This central meeting place was an engineering marvel, carefully sloped during the city's construction to allow water to drain off during public events. Everything about the architecture here suggests a highly stratified society led by charismatic figures who lived above Cahokia's sprawl on the smoothed top of Monk's Mound. Ordinary residents of the city spent many long hours ritualistically hauling clay in baskets from borrow pits to build the mounds. And borrow pits are just deep trenches in the earth. And that's what they call them at Cahokia. The leaders repaid these workers with words of wisdom and massive feasts. But at some point, that just wasn't enough anymore. During the late Sterling phase, there must have been quite a bit of urban unrest. The elites of Monk's Mound erected an enormous wooden palisade wall all the way around the Grand Plaza, effectively enclosing themselves in a walled neighborhood and turning the public space of the plaza into something more private or exclusive. This may have led to more problems. If people were literally kept out of the downtown area by a giant wall, they might feel disenfranchised, said Melissa Baltus, who's one of the archaeologists I hung out with there. Shortly after this wall was erected, the Grand Plaza fell into disrepair. Alt writes that domestic buildings and refuse-filled features seem to have been relocated around and onto the plaza perimeter, perhaps as part of a general redesign of downtown Cahokia in conjunction with the recently built Palisade Wall. By 1300, there were probably few to no residents left in this inner sanctum. In other words, non-elites moved into the area and even dumped their trash there. During this period, people also tore down Woodhinge, which was a great circle of wooden poles that marked the solstice. As the city reshaped itself during the late Moorhead phase, Cahokians violently rejected the people and symbols of their once monumental downtown. Roughly half the city's population moved away, and those who remained began to retreat into their own neighborhoods, conducting smaller public rituals and events. The courtyard and public buildings in the Spring Lake Tract, which is where I was excavating, reflected this new kind of social organization. Local communities had supplanted the city's central authority. A plurality of little plazas might also point toward a democratizing current in Cahokia's public culture too. Like all of the cities that we've seen in this book, Cahokia was not static, and its remains tell a story of a culture that dynamically moved through several phases over the centuries. That's why many archaeologists today are questioning the idea that civilizations have classical or peak phases that we can contrast with a collapse phase. The idea of collapse comes out of the same 19th and early 20th century colonial traditions that brought us the idea of lost cities miraculously discovered by European archaeologists. thinkers in this tradition hold that all societies progress along the same path that European civilizations took, growing bigger, more hierarchical, and more industrialized over time. Societies that don't embrace market economies are dubbed undeveloped, and cities that stop expanding are characterized as failures whose culture has collapsed. But this perspective doesn't fit the evidence. By the 1970s, archaeologists and urban historians had accumulated loads of evidence that urban civilizations have no set developmental pattern. Plenty of cities, including Angkor and Cahokia, are organized around non-market principles. Metropolitan areas expand and contract with waves of immigration over time. When a city population breaks apart into smaller villages, that isn't a failure. It's simply a transformation, often based on sound survival strategies. The culture of that city lives on in the traditions of people whose ancestors lived there, many of whom will go on to build new cities in its image. Civilizations might cycle through a number of high-density urban phases and dispersal phases over the course of centuries. So I'm going to show you just one more picture here. I could show you a ton of stuff, but I'm going to keep it short. This is, by the way, what Monk's Mound, let me share this again. So this is what Monk's Mound looks like now. It's still quite impressive. When you get to the top of Monk's Mound, you can see St. Louis across the river. It's really, really high. And this picture has kind of a funny angle, so it looks flat, but it's really tall. So I wanted to show this picture. So this is right next to Monk's Mound in Cahokia. This is the Mounds Drive-In that was built in 1949 and was on the site right in the middle of this incredible indigenous city that was this treasure of, American history. And people had built a suburb over it and had put this drive-in here. And it was there until 1983, which is when the area became the state park that it is now, devoted to, the sort of celebration and excavation of Cahokia. And to me, this is a classic example of how history gets acknowledged and denied at the same time, because here we have a classic sort of white settler city that's come in and put itself over top of an ancient indigenous site. And this body of water that you see in the foreground here, it floods every year because it's a borrow pit. This is one of the pits that Cahokians dug mud out of to build Monk's Mound. And then they left the pit open because the pit itself was a ceremonial space. And so you would leave it open, and oftentimes people would line these borrow pits with very colorful clay. And the pit's still there, so it floods every year. And the folks who moved in, they knew enough to name their drive-in after these incredible monuments, these mounds, but they kind of were in denial about how important they were. So it's just this odd, acknowledging that here we are in the middle of this incredible city that's full of mounds, but also here's a drive-in and enjoy. So you see this, throughout the southern United States. There's towns that are called Moundville and Mounds. And these are all places that are named after the cities from the Mississippian culture that Cahokia was part of as well, that were these mound building cultures. So oftentimes our understanding of how a city has survived or not survived is kind of colored by these weird moments of acknowledging and not acknowledging that history. And here's also just a cool picture of the archaeologists working. Getting dirty. All right. Okay, let's talk, Sarah.
Yeah, let's talk. Thanks so much for showing those wonderful pictures, by the way. I'm so glad you showed Mounds Theater, because it was one of my favorite details from the book. This drive-in.
It's so weird. I mean, and there's plenty of other places like that in archaeological sites. I think one of my favorites was in Cambodia. We were at the Genocide Museum, as you do, which is a big important part of Cambodian history. And there were all these signs that were like, "Do not play Pokemon Go in the Genocide Museum." So people just have funny ways of remembering history.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like you probably had no idea what a world your book would be coming out in, but I feel like it's also actually a very apt apt world to be discussing the myth of collapse and the end of cities. So I actually wanted to start with a question with it was kind of the last chapter of your book, naturally, as one does, which is you talk about moving to San Francisco in the middle of the dot-com bust in 2000, and like the city's being abandoned. There's IKEA furniture all over the streets, and people are just moving out. And I think the theme you talk about so much in your book is that when a city is being abandoned, it can happen over centuries, and you might not actually know that in your decline. And this kind of micro moment you're in, that's not really this like macro moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how writing this book has now informed your experience of like the past year, where there's so much talk of the end of megacities and like people moving away from cities. Like, how has that been like, having learned actually this history of thousands of years?
Yeah, it's a super good question. And of course, I have been thinking about it a lot. So part of what I was getting at in that final section of the book is that, there are these long, cities exist on a long term, a long time scale. And then there's all of these little burps and kind of explosions and dips. One of those was the dot-com boom in San Francisco. And also, of course, we're in the middle of another tech boom, kind of. So those change the layout of the city. They change the population of the city. The city can grow bigger. People immigrate from different places and change the makeup of the city. And that's a long-term trend too, seeing the city kind of change its shape. So this is a long way of saying that the pandemic is another one of these, I would say, bumps. Of course, I'm not a wizard. I can't see the future. It's possible that this is going to turn into like a full-on zombie apocalypse situation. It doesn't seem like that.
Don't jinx it.
Yeah, sorry.
I thought we were turning a corner.
I mean, I'm just saying, okay? Like, you never know. I just don't want, to be caught like in a year when we're all like hovering in our like little, zombie bunkers and you're like, Annalee said it was going to be fine. So that's not where it's going, right? I mean, pandemics are short-term disasters, even though in the middle of the pandemic, it's been a year, it feels like it's been goddamn forever. And it's hard to inhabit our human time scale of like a year or 2 years and then remember that cities live on a time scale of hundreds of years or thousands of years. And that this, from the perspective of the city, is just a kind of brief destructive phase. And it is destructive. I mean, and it is absolutely changing the shape of our city. And one of the things that's been interesting for me, and I'm sure for other folks who are living in cities, is seeing all the ways that people rebuild to accommodate this kind of disaster. I mean, it's depressing to be enduring this, but it's so hopeful to see so many restaurants, for example, building outdoor areas. We see that all over the place in San Francisco. Like if you walk down a busy retail street, it's now just full of these like outdoor pavilions that have been, some of them are like really decorated and crazy, and some of them are just like literally a shack. And they all look great. And so I think, we will see this moment of a very transformed city. And then very quickly, once the pandemic is contained and vaccines are available to everyone, I think things are going to go back to roughly the same routine. And I think a lot of people who've moved out of San Francisco will move back, and, as their jobs demand, and it'll start to feel like it just didn't make any difference. However, there are many longer term trends that we're dealing with in San Francisco that could easily be part of a trend toward abandonment. For example, the fact that California is on fire for a couple of months every year. And we had in San Francisco, we had the Day of Darkness last year.
Yeah,
where
it was so apocalyptic.
It was really scary, actually.
Yeah.
Even though we knew that we weren't in immediate danger here in the city, it was, it was a harbinger of things to come in terms of how climate disaster is really going to be the thing that I think could lead to one of these slow abandonments, much more than, you know, a 2-year epidemic or pandemic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the cities you talk about is Pompeii, which is obviously famous for having one big disaster.
Yeah.
But a lot of these other cities, it's actually not one big disaster. It's like a slow accumulation. I think once someone called it the sandcastle. Was it sandcastle erosion?
Yeah, exactly. Sandcastle economics is sort of one way that this kind of slow demise is described, where, you know, over time, disaster after disaster adds up, and finally the castle just kind of melts. It can never be fully rebuilt in between disasters. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because even Pompeii had a bunch of disasters. Like, it had had a horrible earthquake about 10 years before the volcano, and everybody's like, it's fine, we'll just rebuild, it's all good. And then it wasn't. So,
well, you also tell this really great story of Pompeii, not just like the, you know, the volcano itself, but what happened after and the people who survived, because we usually just think of, you know, the plaster casts of all the people who died, but actually there were people who saw the smoke, left in time, and they actually tried to rebuild, right?
They did. And this is one of the kind of hopeful stories, or I shouldn't say hopeful, but it's a survival story. And this book is full of that stuff where, you know, there's a kind of cultural myth that, you know, well, Pompeii collapsed and that was it. Nobody ever went back there and everybody who was there died. But in fact, as you said, lots of people made it out. In fact, only about 10% of the population perished in the blast. Because it's likely that it was erupting for many, many hours before the superheated gas came in and just cooked everyone. It was really smoky. And before that, there'd been earthquakes. So people had already been getting out of town because they're like, uh-oh, you know, it's another earthquake. I don't want to be here. And there were very good roads that they could, you know, take to get out of town quickly. So what happened was, after the city was buried in hot ash and some of the cities around, the Emperor Titus came, he toured the site, and he used the Roman government's money to build new neighborhoods in a bunch of neighboring cities for the refugees. And many of these refugees were not fancy ass patricians like the people who would have hobnobbed with Titus back in Rome. These were freedmen and women. They were ex-slaves who were part of the households of patricians who had perished in the fire or perished in the, you know, various volcanic activities. And they managed to rebuild their lives, and they left behind records of their entrepreneurial ventures. They left behind tombstones that made clear that they had come from Pompeii and had been relocated to these other places. And I talked to this archaeologist who was telling me about the kinds of stuff that Emperor Titus and his brother, who took over after Titus died, Domitian, the kind of stuff that they built in these new neighborhoods for these refugees. Like, they built two miniature versions of the Colosseum at Rome.
Wow.
Because Titus's dad actually is the person who started making the Colosseum, which is its own whole weird story. But so they were very proud of it. It was their family's creation, and so they were like, we're gonna make it as good as possible for these refugees. They're gonna have their own Colosseum, and the work required to do that would have been at least a decade. So you're talking about a decade's worth of good, solid work for all of the people in these towns, and then new places to live, new places to play for the people who made it out. So it's actually a story, again, of transformation and survival. And the same kind of story can be told about Cahokia as well, because the people who left Cahokia, who first formed those smaller neighborhoods, and then eventually, as Melissa Baltus, one of the archaeologists I talked to, she said, what it was like is that first, they started forming more isolated neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods became more and more remote from each other until they finally just split off and like went out and created their own villages. And so it's kind of like just this scattering of communities that had come from the city, but they continued to be communities, and there's still tribes today that tell origin stories of like, oh, our people were, involved in this city and now we're here. And it's still alive in the traditions of many tribal groups.
Yeah. You mentioned when you started your reading that you were at a bar kind of bothering these archaeologists with questions about collapse. So when did you start realizing this was like not a good question to ask?
So let's see. I started realizing it. So I spent like about 7 years working on this book. So there was a lot of years of researching before I got down to the writing. So I had plenty of time to ask really dumb questions before I started actually committing.
That's the best part of reporting, is asking the dumb questions.
Asking the dumb questions, and then hopefully asking them enough so that when you finally sit down to write, that you don't write the dumb questions into your book or your article. And so I'd say it was, it was a couple years in, and it was because I had been hanging out at Cahokia and I was talking to Melissa and Sarah Barris, her colleague, who's also excavating there. And I kept asking about collapse and why did people leave? And they kept saying, well, it's not a collapse, it's a transformation. And then that became very clear to me when I started researching Angkor, which is the heart of the Khmer Empire in today's Cambodia. And for a very long time, Western scholarship on Angkor really emphasized how this was a city that had just collapsed and like the whole civilization surrounding it collapsed. Even though, of course, there's a lively Khmer culture that still exists today and certainly existed in the 19th century when, Westerners were, quote unquote, discovering a city that had never been lost.
And people were in fact still living there when it was quote unquote abandoned.
Right. No, there were monks living in the temple enclosures at Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom doing monk stuff. Like it wasn't like they were just there sleeping, like it was a still going concern. And there were tons of farmers living in the area that had once been cities. So it was nobody was under the illusion that it had gone missing, except for this European guy who was like, yay, I can sell a book based on finding the city, which indeed he did. And it became a big best-selling book. And so it's really, at Angkor especially, it's so instructive because it turns out that it was abandoned very slowly over a period of at least 200 years. It was a huge city. I mean, it initially had almost 1 million people. So it took a long time. And it went through, just like Cahokia did, it went through a lot of phases of its abandonment. And one of the big phases was after the royal family had left the city and gone down to Phnom Penh in the south, where they still are today. And the people who stayed there, who would have been, working class people and artisans, also people who may have been freed slaves. And they were recycling a lot of the parts of the buildings that had once been devoted to like the wealthy elites. And so they kind of took it upon themselves to say, well, maybe we don't have the ability to mobilize laborers to build us big fancy stuff, but we can certainly take apart what's already here. And they repaired bridges and that would have been going on, like I said, for like at least 100, 200 years. And so if you were living in Angkor at that time, you could have had 3 generations of people who were like, yeah, I live at Angkor, I live at the city, and, this is a real city. And like, it just doesn't, it's not as big as it used to be, but it's still awesome. And we still love it. And, it's not dead or collapsed. But I think there's, part of the myth of collapse is that a city is only as good as its elites. And so once the elites are gone, who cares about that city? And I think that's part of why, that myth continues is that, we're just so obsessed with like if all the rich people leave San Francisco, I guarantee you that will be the moment that you get all the think pieces about how San Francisco is dead.
I feel like we are getting those big pieces already, right?
Yeah, like, is Twitter's dead? Silicon Valley might not be as powerful as it once was. Well, I guess the area is dead. And it's like, hey, 1 million of us still living here, guys. Like,
yeah, we're still out there. Yeah,
we're still here.
Well, I think it's so. I think about how hard archaeology is, right? Like how much there is to life and culture and how little of it actually gets preserved in the earth because it's really just stone and ceramic that gets preserved. And I think your book is like this, but any book about archaeology kind of has to go through a lot of things that archaeologists got wrong for hundreds of years. I wonder
That's true.
I wonder if you thought about things that we still have gotten wrong. That if you're writing this book 50 years, 100 years from now, like you'd be like, oops, they didn't know anything in 2022 or 2021.
Yeah, I am sure that we're getting things wrong still. I mean, obviously I have present bias, so I'm like, well, obviously we're much better now than we were in the past. So, I think there's a lot of stuff that archaeologists are now getting right. For example, even just something as simple as consulting with indigenous archaeologists or indigenous folks about their own traditions and histories when excavating in these places, like Cahokia. And in the case of Angkor, again, working with local Khmer archaeologists and working with people who are familiar with contemporary Khmer culture. And so that's it's not easy, but it is a simple thing. It's a low-hanging fruit thing that archaeologists can do to more fully appreciate the importance of what they're looking at. But things that I think we're getting wrong. One thing that I really am convinced of is that I think that there must have been some form of writing at Cahokia that wasn't preserved, and it could have been like the quipu writing of the Inca, which is done with textiles. So they create these big textiles with knots and colors that tell stories or that allow them to do counting and various kinds of census data and all of that stuff. And we're still, there's a group at Harvard actually that's trying to translate the quipu. And so we know that there are forms of writing in the Americas that don't resemble anything that we have in the West or in Asia, and that are nevertheless written records, and that are also very perishable. And so the thing at Cahokia is that it's a frickin' really muddy, humid place. Most of the city is gone because it was made of wood. And so I really, they had these poles planted everywhere in the city. And I'm like, I bet those poles had some kind of symbolic communication, or maybe they communicated using bark or wood, and it just didn't last. It just seems to me completely bonkers to say, oh, this cosmopolitan city full of immigrants at the heart of its civilization, it's incredibly, it's like, this is a city that's based on 3 previous generations of mound cities that go back like 5,000 years in the Americas. This is like that, this is a sophisticated place. I feel like there's something we're missing there, and I hope we find it. That would be awesome. So I think that's something we're getting wrong for sure. And I suspect that, again, we're going to be, especially at places like Çatalhöyük, which we haven't talked about very much, which is like a 9,000-year-old city in Turkey. I think we're going to be finding more stuff there too that's going to help us understand their culture. And that's just a matter of, folks have excavated a lot of stuff there, and now it's analysis time. And so, as you know, from, covering science a lot, it's like there's the data gathering, and that's very exciting. And then like 20 years later, we've analyzed all the data and we've kind of figured out what it means. And so, I think there's a lot more to find out.
But let's talk a little about Çatalhöyük, because I think I think it's one of the first cities, right? And I think, I don't know, I think those of us who live with cities right now, we're like, well, cities naturally exist, but they did not exist for a lot of human existence. And with the city comes a lot of things that are new, especially, as you write, the idea of public space and private space, because, I'll let you describe it, but they kind of had, their public space was kind of like above ground, right? And you live privately below ground. And I just been thinking a lot about public space and private space with the pandemic, because, I think there's been this almost strange inversion. A lot of our public space is empty, but now our private spaces are public. Like my living room is now in a public space.
Same. This is my study. So it's like,
exactly. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the like kind of the invention of public and private.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, it's so Çatalhöyük is it is one of the first cities. I should explain that there's a debate about whether it is a city, because it's kind of in this, it's a transitional phase for humanity. So for most of our existence as a species, humans have been nomadic, and that means that we've traveled around seasonally. We've, hunted and gathered and, made camp sometimes for, weeks at a time, but still always moving, not having like a permanent settlement. And so imagine being from a species that has spent like 100,000 or 200,000 years on the move. We've invented every possible cultural ideal around that kind of life, right? So our belief systems are shaped by movement, by being out in the open, by being in small groups. And then at a certain point, people start staying longer and longer in these seasonal camps. And finally, they start living there year round. And that requires the invention of agriculture. And there's lots and lots of proto-agriculture. It's not like people were just like, whoa, I had an idea. Why don't we do agriculture? I mean, there's evidence now, and I talk about this in the book, that people have been engaging in agricultural-like activities for at least 45,000 years. And there's actually a great book that I'm just reading now called Dark Emu, which is about indigenous Australians farming in Australia 45,000 years ago. So it's happening everywhere. People know about it. And it's just a matter of saying, can we intensify this activity enough to stay in one place? And then once you decide to do that and you start staying in one place, people start forming little villages of like 100, 200 people. But then at Çatal, it's like 5,000 people, maybe more, maybe 10,000 people. It's crazy. And, compared to the past, it's just this huge disjuncture. And people are living in these little mud brick houses in a kind of honeycomb shape. Actually, I'll share my screen with you and you can see the exciting layout of Çatal. Okay. All right, so you can see Çatal. Whoa, I didn't know I could do that. I can make it big. So this is the just the layout where the houses are all sharing walls, and people did a lot of work on their roofs, and their doors were actually in their ceilings. And so sidewalks kind of went across the roof. And so as Sarah was saying, the public space is kind of in the upper level of the city on the rooftops. And then you have these private spaces in your house below the sidewalk level. And you have to imagine that it would have been completely weird for people whose parents and grandparents told them stories of life living basically in tents in big open spaces. And suddenly they're having to figure out how to live in little boxes, always stuck next to their neighbors in this incredibly stinky, loud, hot place. And so there's some archaeologists believe that there was a kind of crisis for humanity when humans were having to wrap their minds around how do you build a society in this way that just seems so counterintuitive. And the invention of the idea of privacy, not that people sort of said, all right, hereby we create privacy and we are making a note of it. But the sort of beginnings of behaving as if there are private spaces versus public spaces is part of the kind of psychological coping mechanism that we develop. And I think you're right that the thing that's funny about public and private is that even though they are opposites, they often invert. And so you often see these kinds of moments where things that we thought were private become public. Obviously, we're going through this now with learning about surveillance on the internet and that kind of thing. And the pandemic changes it. But also different civilizations have different attitudes toward it. At Pompeii and in sort of ancient Rome, the inside of one's house was kind of a public space, and people could kind of wander into your atrium from the street if they wanted to meet with the man of the house, for example. And that was a public part of your house, and it was kind of like not really private, even though for me, like if someone just wandered into my living room and was like, hey, I wanted to talk to you about cities, I'd be really upset unless it was a friend. So
it's so fascinating that living in the city comes with, as you say, these like psychological coping mechanisms. And one of the other things you talk about is how once we start settling, where you are from becomes important rather than who you're descended from. And that's just something that's so like, oh yeah, the first thing you ask someone is like, where are you from? But that was used to not mean anything.
Yeah, like if you're a nomad, like where you're from is like, I'm from my parents, you know, and so the way that you identify yourself is like, well, I'm from this tribe, and this tribe has all these characteristics, and like we love horses or whatever, you know. I'm just like now randomly inventing a horse tribe, but like, but that's sort of how people identified themselves. And then as soon as you do have settlements, you say, well, I'm from Pompeii, or I'm from Cahokia, or I'm from San Francisco. And when I say I'm from San Francisco, that means something. Like people make a lot of assumptions about me based on that. You know, in the same way that people make assumptions about people from Istanbul or from Sao Paulo. And you think you know a lot about someone just based on where they live. And that's, again, that's settlement thinking.
Totally.
That's coming out of this really new idea.
Yeah. And for those of us who maybe haven't lived in one place for most of our lives, or haven't lived in one place for a long time, it's actually kind of a difficult question to answer sometimes. Is it where do I grow up, or where do I currently live?
Yeah, it really is true. And I think, and it becomes a source of bias too, you know, bias against people from certain places, but also bias against people who, like you said, are like, well, I'm from like 20 places, like, and suddenly people are like, what's wrong with you? That's a suspicious identity. And that's just because there's been this inversion where like the norm is settlement as opposed to motion. And that's just insane. Like humans have only been thinking that way for 9,000 years. We're a 200,000-year-old species. So this is, I mean, we're the freaks is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. The early humans be like, why are you living in these crowded places?
They just, yeah, I think they would, can you imagine Homo erectus would just be like, you guys, no, this is not
in Manhattan.
Not a thing.
Yeah.
Should we take some questions from the audience? Are there?
I do have some questions from the audience. I'm going to grab this first one from our Q&A section. Eric asks, well, states first, I understand your point that the pandemic is a short-term crisis. However, it is tied to a much bigger, longer-term crisis, the Anthropocene. Do you think that the Anthropocene poses an unprecedented challenge to all of the world's cities?
Well, I mean, the Anthropocene is when we start having cities. So, you know, obviously the Anthropocene is, you know, it's a city time. In fact, the Anthropocene starts before cities. So, is the Anthropocene going to challenge cities? I mean, the Anthropocene won't, as I hinted earlier. You know, in fact, every time someone asks me about the pandemic, I always say, actually, the real issue is climate change. And I think that is going to be, I think that climate change and climate transformation is going to define urbanism for at least the next 1,000 years. And it's something that we can't get out of unless, you know, again, you know, there could be some black swan event. Sure, we could find alien technology in space. I don't, you know, but if we continue on the trajectory that we're on, all of our cities will be reshaped by climate change. Coastal cities will have to move inland. Places like California, where I live, are going to have to get their act together on how to do controlled burning in order to prevent the whole state from burning down every year. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be an interesting time of people having to reclaim more ancient forms of engaging with the environment. For example, like with controlled burning, which is something that indigenous folks knew about for, you know, tens of thousands of years, but also incorporating new forms of technology, new ways of building sustainably. So yeah, the pandemic is a short-term thing. But also I agree, pandemics will become more common because of climate change for sure. And other reasons too. But yeah, this is our urban challenge. And I do think that cities will survive it. Several of the cities in this book dealt with radical climate disasters and managed to make it through. But my final thought on that is that the what we really need, aside from new ways of building and obviously engaging in sustainable social structures, we also need better government. And I think that this next 1,000 years, as we struggle with climate change, is also going to be a struggle with how to have democracy that allows us to have a sustainable civilization. So it's a political struggle as well as a kind of purely technical struggle with all of the mess we've made in the Anthropocene.
And I feel like you illustrate that point really clearly and interestingly in the chapter on Angkor, and how the sort of political situation was part of why they were losing infrastructure and some of those support systems. So check out the book.
Learn more about government.
Speaking of climate change, Kent asks, speaking of California and other Western cities, are there any projections rattling around out there centering around how diminishing groundwater supply might spark transformation for those metropolises, kind of in the same vein of question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not an expert in, groundwater projections. I do know just from my kind of dilettante understanding that, yeah, this is another of these issues that is going to be incredibly vital going forward, and how we manage our water infrastructure and how we try to maintain that groundwater is going to be, again, it's going to be a technical challenge, but it's also going to be a political challenge. And that's always the difficulty, is kind of juggling both of those. And I think if there's one kind of overarching message of my book and message from the research I did, it's that cities survive, or I should say, people abandon cities when there's a combination of climate challenges and governmental challenges. So if you have a decent government that is trying to actually help the people in the city, they can actually withstand some pretty gnarly stuff like major flooding and fires and all kinds of stuff. But if you have a government that just says, do it yourself, figure out your own way of fixing this, that's when people just say, screw it, I'm leaving. I'd rather live somewhere else.
Yeah. Jared, sorry, I'm getting good question flow from our viewers today. Thank you. Jared says, thanks so much for speaking, and I'm excited to get your book. Can you talk a bit about some of the lessons you learned from these cities in the past that we can use to rethink how we build, live, and talk about cities today? I'm specifically thinking about how we build more flexibility and robustness into city planning in the face of climate change, but I'm also fascinated by the psychological and cultural aspects of city life that you mentioned.
This is a huge question. It's kind of, the entire book is sort of like, here, have a book. So some of it I've already been talking about, right? That these challenges are both social and political, as well as sort of technical and ultimately environmental. So I think, as I discussed earlier, like one of the big lessons that I learned is that cities can come back from a period of abandonment. And that was why I wanted to read to you guys from the Cahokia section tonight, because the city did go through these major transformations, which archaeologists refer to as revitalizations. And we still use that language when talking about cities now. We talk about revitalization projects in cities. Sometimes revitalization projects in cities are thinly veiled gentrification projects. And that's not what I'm talking about here. I know that revitalization can go terribly. I live in San Francisco, so I know what it looks like. But there can be urban revitalizations like what we see in Detroit, or what we see in parts of Atlanta, where people who are in frontline communities or from historically marginalized groups are given grants to help make urban farms, or to rebuild community centers, or to rebuild public spaces. One of the really important parts of cities is public space. Cities are public. Like, a city is literally human public space. and also non-human animals too. Like lots of animals like to live in cities. And I do think that, although I don't talk about it too much in this book, certainly making better spaces for non-human animals is a big part of building sustainably. Making sure that like, if you have migrations that go through your city, maybe make room for it. There's like, have turtle crossings like they do in Davis in California, or figure out how to prevent birds from running into your turbines for generating wind energy and stuff like that. So the lesson really is to remember, I think, that cities are for the public. They're shared spaces and we make them together. And the most important part of making a city is treating workers well, because it's workers who make the city happen. And everything from construction workers to people working in a bar. The elites do some stuff. They hang out and make the city maybe glamorous or bring in some money. But the people who really make the city run are working people, just regular folks. And so mistreating them, giving them a minimum wage that isn't a livable wage, that's a way to screw your city over.
Annalee,
Not that I have thoughts about minimum wage. Sorry.
I was going to say, while I was reading your book, it's it's a book about cities, but I feel like it was actually secretly a book about a history of labor.
Yeah, you caught me. Yeah, it is, because cities are basically labor-made concrete a lot of the time, and a lot of the new discoveries in archaeology that I'm super interested in this book are discoveries that have allowed us to understand what the lives of laborers were like in these cities, because we already kind of knew, like, what was it like to be Emperor Titus, or like, what was it like to be King Jayavarman VII? Like, we know because he carved his frickin' face into every goddamn temple he could the whole time he was king. And like, yay, he was a cool king, but like, also enough of that. Like, let's hear about the people who actually carved those faces and not, Jayavarman. Cool guy, but like I said, I'm ready to hear more about other people.
Speaking of Detroit, Eric asks, do you see parallels between the changes in places like Cahokia and a city like Detroit?
I think so. It's the thing that's frustrating, of course, about this stuff is that we're talking about long time scales, right? So, in 50 years, I might be able to say very confidently, like, yes, we see a parallel. Right now, yeah, it looks like it. I think that it's a common pattern where cities are partially abandoned and the people who remain reuse the space in new ways. And that's what I think is the parallel there. And also the parallel of, elites leaving, the wealthiest classes leaving. And then the people who are left to rebuild are people who often, unfortunately are the most vulnerable and don't necessarily have the resources to rebuild. So.
Lane is curious, what motivated you to write the book? Was there particular research that you were doing about lost cities that kept popping up and that you were like, I need to put all this together? Or was it a slow growing and diminishing, like the cities that you write about? He's also curious if you have any other book recommendations on the subject. So,
yeah, absolutely. I love cities. I grew up in a suburb and got out of there as quickly as I could to move to cities. And so I think, like a lot of writers, I kind of want to ruin things that I love by researching them to the point where I understand all the problems with them. So the book came out of love for sure, and out of care for my own city, and which is San Francisco. And I also had been, as Sarah probably knows, I have been writing about ancient cities for a long time. And so that it was also that as a journalist, I kept finding myself intrigued by these stories and getting more and more excited about them. So of course, there's lots of other great writing about cities and about ancient civilizations. Like everyone, I'm a fan of Charles Mann, who wrote 1491, and is a friend of mine and actually gave me a lot of input on this book. So all of the good stuff in this book probably came from his encouragement. There's a researcher I think she's at UCLA. Her name is Monica Smith. She studies cities, and she has a new book, or relatively recent book, about cities that I would recommend. What else would I recommend? I mean, there's tons of stuff. And this is always the worst question, because of course, you have like, but there's 1,000. Let's see. Oh, another one is Valerie Hansen, who is a scholar at Yale, and she's written a lot about cities on the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road across the Asian continent. If I could have, I would have written about some of the cities that she talks about, like Samarkand, which is now in Uzbekistan and used to be like at the heart of trade on the Silk Road. So she's great. I would recommend any of her stuff about the Silk Road, or she has a new book now about the year 1000 and sort of what was happening at that time. I also want to recommend a book that I actually got out of my bookshelf to show you guys. This is called, let's see if I can make it work. Questioning Collapse by Patricia McInerney and Norman Yaffe. This is an anthology by archaeologists about the narrative of collapse and why it's all wrong, and why Jared Diamond, why when you bring up Jared Diamond around archaeologists, sometimes, like cartoon characters when they get the whirly thing in their eyes and their like ears start, that happens. So this is a very polite response to his work and why he may have gotten it wrong.
There are some less polite responses too.
Yes. I talk about that in my book. Yeah. There's definitely the responses range from polite to extremely frustrated and salty.
I would be curious, and I feel like this sort of leads into one of our next questions. Is there which of these 4 cities would you have liked to have lived in during their like height of, and then which one would you want to live in as it's sort of flowing away, like the tide is going out?
I guess, it's funny because like, obviously I picked these cities because I love all of them. So I kind of wish I could have visited all of them. I don't know if I would have wanted to like stay there forever, which is kind of how I feel about a lot of cities on Earth now. But I think they would all be fascinating. And like the thing about cities that I learned doing this book that was also quite surprising to me, even though in retrospect it's not surprising, is that people go to cities to have parties. And all of these cities had great parties. And we know this because parties leave a distinct signature in the record, in like the archaeological record, because when you have a party, you throw away a lot of partially eaten food. And so whenever you see evidence of large fires and partially eaten food and like broken dishes and like discarded jewelry and like, a couple of other baubles, there's been a party. And the volume of that stuff tells you how big the party was. And at Cahokia, oh my, some big trash pits full of barbecue bones and a couple of human finger bones. And so I think it would have been great to go see the parties, but also I'm a nerd, so big parties kind of start to freak me out. So I think I would have checked out the parties and then been like, okay, where are all the nerds hanging out talking about like cool science stuff? And they would have been like, they wouldn't have called it science necessarily, but they would have had libraries or like museums. And I would have just like definitely been up for that for sure. And also if I spoke the language and stuff like that, I would need a translator.
Kent is jumping in on the party idea, and he asks, I hate to ask this, are cities about the accumulation of different types of human capital?
So so by human capital, I assume that he's referring to slavery, but I'm not actually sure. So yeah, I mean, I think we can't be sure. We know for sure, sorry, let me back up. We know for sure that they had slaves in Rome because we have lots of surviving legal documents that deal with how to treat slaves, how to engage in manumission. In Rome, in Roman culture, slavery was super common, but so was manumission. So oftentimes if a slave lived long enough and was lucky enough, they did get to be free. And I would say quote unquote free because they would always wear the stigma of slavery. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold certain kinds of public office. So they were still screwed over, but they weren't completely enslaved. At Angkor, they had a system of debt slavery where people would basically kind of like pay your taxes in labor. So you might work for free for the local elites for like 2 months of the year or like 1 week a month or however they worked it out. And there's lots and lots of written records that attest to this. Both men and women did this and did different kinds of jobs. And sometimes, the jobs were pretty good and most of the time, they were shitty jobs. We don't know what happened at Cahokia. The archaeologists I've talked to all are very against the idea of thinking that there were slaves there. And I'm not sure why. I think they must have good evidence that I didn't really understand because they certainly were building these giant earthen mounds that you couldn't pay me to build. I mean, it doesn't see, it's like, how did they get that? The theory is that people did it out of it was like a religious ritual. And so people did it voluntarily. And that could be true. Like I could imagine that. It still seems like backbreaking work. So, okay, long-winded answer is yes. Cities are created through what archaeologists call the mobilization of human labor, which is a very capacious term that can encompass slavery or like the sort of ritualistic activities that happened at Cahokia, or just wage slavery. Like, okay, this is the only job available to you, come to the city and work, which you see under capitalism all the time. So yeah, it's a thing. And actually in ancient Rome, scholars believed that the majority of the population was either was enslaved or formerly enslaved. So yeah, it doesn't have to be that way. It absolutely doesn't have to be that way, but it historically has been the case. Yeah.
Well, speaking of the future, Janelle, I believe, asks, have you seen an equivalent of Mounds Drive-In in science fiction?
Wow. I mean, it would be cool. I'm trying to think like what that would be. It would have to be like a monument to a civilization that we denied existed. I bet there's some in the Star Wars universe because that's what I love about the Star Wars universe is it's like really ancient and they have all these colonial incursions. So I'm going to say, Janelle, you need to give me the answer to that question.
There's also been, I feel like just my little bookseller hat coming on. There is some really great sort of quiet science fiction that isn't the dramatic space opera. I'm thinking particularly of The Soul Majestic, which is about a space diner.
Yes, I love that. Yeah. And it's like, and there's certainly a lot of science fiction that deals with archaeology. Like Anne Leckie writes about archaeology. Arkady Martine has a great new trilogy that she's just started that won an award. And yeah, I mean, so I think, the deep past and the deep future are often kind of part of the same imaginative zone in our minds. So
there's also Archaeology from Space.
Yes.
Which is nonfiction by Sarah Parsak.
Yes, I should have recommended that when I was talking about cities. Yeah, I'm actually going to be in conversation with Sarah at some point, Sarah Parkek, sometime next month. So yeah, she's amazing. And she uses satellite imagery to find cities and structures that have been buried in the sand in ancient Egypt, or cities from ancient Egypt that are buried in contemporary sand. And she's a big proponent of using high technology to find out the stories of regular people. So she's great. So Archaeology from Space, check it out.
Yes. The other two, just to reiterate, the other two science fiction writers that you mentioned were Arkady Martine, and the first book in their series is called A Memory Called Empire, and the second book will be coming out this summer. Yay. And the second, sorry, I'm just trying to track back. Who was the second author that you mentioned?
Anne Leckie.
Anne Leckie, Ancillary Justice. And the new one in space is Provenance. So lots of great stuff to check out from Anne Leckie. If this is your final request for question boarding, we are reaching our time limit. So I do want to say thank you so much for joining us, Annalee and Sarah. It's been an absolute delight. If you don't yet have your copy of Four Lost Cities, do be sure to visit the link in the chat to pick up your copy from one of your favorite sponsoring stores. And do look for those other events that Annalee is doing. I feel like I'm going to go hunt down the Eventbrite link for your conversation with Susan Parsak. Thank you so much to Sarah for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great evening.
And everybody check out Sarah Zhang's articles at The Atlantic. You can find her easily. Her stuff is always amazing. So if you need distraction and you want great science journalism, that's where you go.
Thank you. Though I unfortunately don't have much distraction. I only have a lot of COVID coverage right now. So maybe go back in the archives.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, your COVID stuff is amazing. So it's like, but it's true that it's serious. You should take it seriously. Yeah.
You can probably also find both of them on social media if you are interested in other fun things that they are sharing with the world. So check out social media, check out those news outlets, and don't be afraid to check out Annalee's podcast as well.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Thanks so much for hosting
everyone.
us.
Have a great evening.
Bye.